Well, hey there everyone. Welcome back into VG Emporium, video game music and more. And I'd like to start off by saying that it was a blast having Gene Drayband of Pixelated Audio here last week. And it was pretty interesting talking about the topic that he brought in, which was musicians famous outside of VGM. So basically they were people that either were just musicians that were famous and were brought in to do a video game music soundtrack because the people that just like their music, or they started making video game music in the case of Yoko Kanno and then went on to become like a huge anime and TV show composer. And I eagerly await when he comes back again with a topic that is just too weird for Pixelated Audio, but not too weird for VG Emporium. And in truth, nothing is too weird for VG Emporium. Today's topic is not so weird, and in fact, it actually could be considered normal in most cases, the comparison between two different versions of a game. In this case, we have 3 games, and 3 times 2 equals 6. And going back to our 3, the ones that we're going to be covering today are Willow, Nemo, and Ninja Gaiden. And we're going to be looking at the NES/Famicom versions versus the arcade versions. Yes, there were arcade versions of these 3 games. And the 2 versions of each game are vastly different from each other, not only soundtrack-wise, but also gameplay-wise and obviously visually. And this was partially inspired by an episode of Retronauts that came out a few weeks ago, where they obviously talked about the movie, the recent TV show that came out, the unfortunate book series, and of course, the 2 games that spawned off of it. So obviously we're going to start this off with Willow. And the track that we opened up with was Prologue from Willow on the NES, composed by Harumi Fujita. And as you could probably tell by the name of that composer, as well as by just the sound of the song, this is a Capcom game. And this game is Capcom's stab at doing an action RPG a la Zelda, but probably more like Crystallis. And so in this game you play as the Melwin, Willow Ulfgood, and he is tasked to go take on the world and do stuff and fight Bad Morta. And the thing about this game is that it does not follow the story of the movie. Barely. It has some things that are in there, some of the locations, some of the characters. You get Laura Dannon just only shows up once and that's it. I've only seen this game played once. I never actually played it myself. This is back one of my first memories of seeing a video game in action, and this was at a kid's house that I was being babysat at. They were playing it, and I just remember it looked cool. It sounded cool. And, I remember liking the movie at the time too. So this one, even though I've only saw it played once and maybe played around with it a little bit on emulators, it kind of stuck with me. And surprisingly, one of the songs that actually really stuck with me, even all these years later, 30 plus years later, is this next song I'm going to play for you next, which is House, Dialogue, and Treasure from Willow on the NES, composed by Harumi Fujita. That was House, Dialogue, and Treasure Chest from Willow on the NES, composed by Harumi Fujita. And so as I mentioned earlier, this game is an action RPG, but instead of how Zelda works, where it's you're going over the overworld and then you encounter enemies and you fight them, you're going around the overworld, but there are scenes it's random battles, but the battles happen in one screen and you get to freely move around and you fight enemies and the wind blow, you see the grass and the wind blowing has its own battle theme and stuff, and then it transitions back to the screen. You can go into, as this name of the song would suggest, into houses, have dialogues with characters, and get treasure chests. And I'd imagine this is kind of the equivalent of a shop theme even. I'm not sure if there are shops in this game. Put that aside. Yes, this song, for some odd reason, just stuck with me for these 30 plus years. Just every once in a while, just play in my head, and I'm oh, I remember that. I like those noises. But now let's flash back about 10 years ago, and my adventures on BGM Rips kind of getting really into full swing, and one of the things I come across is Willow, and it's not the NES version, it's arcade, it's FM, and you can probably imagine my surprise at making this little discovery. So, to bring us in with this arcade version, I'm going to play you Shop from Willow on the arcade, this one composed by Takeshi Tateishi. that was Shop from Willow, the arcade version, composed by Takeshi Tateishi. And this was also developed by Capcom. So now my brain is going, this game, it can't be like the NES version, like, it's not the same game, can it be? And then I looked it up, and it's an action platformer, wherein you get to play as both Willow and Mad Mardigan, switching off between stages. Willow being the magic user and projectiles, and Mad Mardigan being the sword guy, melee things. So now, unlike the NES version of the game, which is almost like an AU of the original story, this game follows the movie story pretty closely, follows all the beats, you get to meet all the characters, get to go to all the locations, etc., etc. And it's pretty easy to tell that this arcade version of the game was meant to be a Willow game, to tie in with the movie, whereas the NES version was probably just a game that was being developed by Capcom, and they're like, let's slap Willow in there and it'll be good, people will buy it. So now the other thing is I don't ever remember seeing this game in the wild at all, and the Retronauts crew, same thing. I think one of them said they saw it once at like some kind of con, but that was it. So maybe like a limited release cabinet or something, I don't know. And so neither of these games feature the same music, not even the theme from the movie. But they do share locations, and one of the locations that you should, if you're familiar with the movie, should know is going to be like the obvious end game, is Nockmar Castle, where the last battle with Bab Morta is set to happen, the wabba Bab Morta, you crazy old lady. But anyway, so what we're going to play here next is from Willow, the NES version, is Nockmar Castle, composed by Harumi Fujita, and then from the arcade version is going to be Nockmar Tower, Stage 6-2, by Takeshi Tateishi. so those were, in order, Nockmar Castle from Willow, the NES version, composed by Harumi Fujita, followed by Nockmar Tower, Stage 6-2, from Willow, the arcade version, composed by Takeshi Tateishi. And as you can tell, very different, but they both lead up to the same conclusion, the last battle with Bavmorda. And for both of these, the battle between Willow and Bavmorda is definitely a lot more epic than it was in the movie, because in the movie, the battle between Finrazel and Bavmorda, using magic against each other was pretty cool, but then when it comes to Willow versus Bavmorda, it's a little anticlimactic, just to say that, Willow doesn't do anything too fancy. He just pulls off one of his little tricks that we see at the beginning of the movie, and Bavmorda has a fit, and then that's it. And if you want to know, what happens, go watch it, if you haven't seen it already. It's not a perfect movie by any means, but it is a fun one. And the show was actually surprisingly good for what it was. And hey, give these games a check out. The only way to really play them is via emulation if you don't have the actual hardware nearby. And the arcade version is just a standard action platformer, most like you would see all over the arcades. But the NES version is a pretty interesting action adventure RPG. It would be really cool if they had done another game with this same concept, but a little more fleshed out. So now moving on to our next set of games here, we have Nemo the Dream Master, which is the Capcom NES classic, and then Nemo on the arcade, which, again, I never saw in the wild. I don't know anybody who has. And again, they don't share any music, but they do share that they are platformers. They are not the same games. Oh, my no siree. The NES version is a kind of like a puzzle platformer, if you will, and then the arcade version is just another action platformer. So we're going to get more into them after these next set of songs. Starting off with Slumberland from Nemo the Dream Master on the NES, composed by Junko Tamiya, and then followed by Slumberland Stage 2 from Nemo, composed by Yoko Shimomura. Welcome back. And those were, in order, Slumberland from Little Nemo the Dream Master on the NES, composed by Junko Tamiya, followed by Slumberland Stage 2 from Nemo the arcade version, composed by Yoko Shimomura. So now for those of you listening that may happen to be under the age of 30, you may think, first thing that comes to mind when you think of Nemo is Finding Nemo, the Pixar Disney movie. And for many, because of school reading, may recognize the name Nemo as Captain Nemo from the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by author Jules Verne. But for those my age and older may have another reference for this name, which is from the animated movie Little Nemo, which both these games are based off of and drew most of their inspiration from. But aha, this goes a little deeper because the movie Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland is based off the comic strip from the early 1900s called Little Nemo in Slumberland, with a nice 22-year run from 1905 to 1927. And it was an interesting little strip because the creator, Winsor McKay, experimented with the layout of the comic strip, like all the panels and everything, because it's based in a dream, so anything is possible. So it's just doing all these really cool experimental things with it, all with a really nice Art Nouveau style. So back to the games. So these games were made shortly after the movie released in Japan in 1989. But it's another case of where the NES version, it takes a little bit more liberties with the story, so it's not directly based off the movie. It does borrow some more elements from the comic strip, whereas the arcade version does follow the movies beats a little bit more closely. And I know I should be talking about the music, but for the NES game, what more can I say? I mean, I imagine this has already been talked a bunch about because it is one of those beloved Capcom titles, I think. And yeah, remixes abound. Probably other podcasts will talk about it, but as far as the arcade version, I'm not quite so sure. But as you could probably tell, it's pretty meaty and powerful. Yoko Shimomura behind the wheel on this one. And as far as OSTs go, this one is actually, it's pretty good. It's nothing to be really excited about, but there are some tracks in here that are really good. It's like this one. This is one of my favorites. The version of Slumberland from the NES is may not be as energetic as the other songs in the OST, but it's still pretty nice. It's like, the stage is kind of a little more leisurely, like kind of that more puzzle platformy type thing, whereas the rest of the game is, I don't know what to call it. It's a platformer, an adventure exploration platformer, something like that. I don't know. But these next set of tracks here are really good showcases of the Capcom NES and the Capcom arcade musical styles, because you gotta save the best for last, obviously. So we're gonna play you next. Here is Nightmareland from Little Nemo the Dream Master on the NES, composed by Junko Tamiya, followed by Nightmare Castle, Stage 6, from Nemo, the arcade version, composed by Yoko Shimomura. Nightmareland, from Little Nemo the Dream Master on the NES, composed by Junko Tamiya, followed by Nightmare Castle, Stage 6, from Nemo in the arcade, composed by Yoko Shimomura. Yeah, so whereas the NES version could definitely be a Mega Man, like, Wily Castle theme, most likely is Mega Man 4. The arcade version kind of sounds like Yoko Shimomura's, like, future RPG works. Like, if you were to take this song and reorchestrate it in the style of Legend of Mana, say, that would fit right in there. So now I haven't really talked about the gameplay differences between these games, so here we go. So the NES version is, like I said, it's kind of a weird mix of exploration, puzzle, action platformer. It's, you go, you're little Nemo, and you start, you're running around, and you're throwing candies at monsters and to put them to sleep so you could get inside of them and get costumes so you could get their powers, so you can get a mole, so you can dig around, get this weird frog creature thing so you could jump around, a bee so you could fly around, get on the back of a gorilla, on a salamander, all these crazy things, and you gotta find keys to open up doors to get onto the next stage. Whereas the arcade version is kind of your standard side-scrolling platformer slash brawler, because like you play through 7 stages, first player is always Nemo, and then if there's a second player, they're Flip, a cigar-smoking clown that always seems to get Nemo in some kind of crazy trouble. And you go through the stages just beating up enemies as they come at you until you get to the final boss, and you just gotta keep attacking them until they're dead. And then onto the next stage, and you get power-ups and, all that stuff. So yes, these games obviously don't share anything musically, but they do share locations and scenes and, some of the beats from the film adaptation of Little Nemo. Though these locations do show up in different orders in the, each game. So I have played Little Nemo the Dream Master, though I could not get past the Toy World or, the train stage. I did get a hold of a friend's Game Genie so I could put in a code to get to the last level, and it was glitchy as hell, and I couldn't figure out what to do because it gave me the wand, and I didn't get to use that. I didn't know how to use that scepter thing, so I was lost there. And of course, never played the arcade version because I never saw it in the wild. I haven't emulated it yet, but I probably should give it a go at some point. And so now this brings us to our last set of NES and arcade versions that differ vastly, and that would be Ninja Gaiden, called Ninja Ryokenden in Japan, and Shadow Warriors in Europe, because, Europe and the Brits don't like the word ninja for some reason. And we're going to open up with the NES version of Ninja Gaiden, and this is going to be Bravery on the Clutches, composed by Ryuichi Nitta. That was Bravery on the Clutches, from Ninja Gaiden on the NES, composed by Ryuichi Nitta. And I'll admit, it was a little tough to bring this one on because, one, it's been, probably played to death on so many different podcasts and remixes. There's not a track on here that is, probably not too unknown or too weird, or I don't know what to say. It's one of those quintessential powerhouse NES soundtracks that, everybody just loves because it's just so hard hitting with those percussion samples and just like the phasing effect on the square channels and the really nice galloping bass. And then the game itself is also just a gem because of just, one, the cutscenes, like the pacing of the story, just the way how everything moves is really cool. It's a really tough game, but it wasn't too tough, as compared to some more poorly designed games where, this game does have some cheap moments. Believe you me, very cheap moments, such as getting to the very last boss and then you lose your last life and your last continue and you have to start all the way from the beginning again. Rosy colored memories. And the story is actually pretty elaborate for like an NES game at the time, 1989. And, follows Ryo Hayabusa as he goes on, goes on adventure, I don't know, seeking revenge on his father's death, but also getting more and more embroiled in this plot of world domination and CIA shenanigans and weirdo stuff. But not as weird as the arcade counterpart that was being developed at the same time. Because yes, there is an arcade version, and these two games are very different from each other, whereas the NES version is a action game that requires some precision and has some platforming elements with a really elaborate story. Like, it takes itself pretty seriously. The arcade version is a side-scrolling brawler with like some really cool action going on, and it doesn't take itself seriously at all. In fact, it's just ridiculous as F. And they hardly share any similarities other than the fact that they're called Ninja Gaiden and you play as a blue ninja. And the bosses in the arcade version are definitely not as elaborate as the NES version. So with that, I'm going to play you the next track here, which is Sumo Wrestler from LA Stage and Grand Canyon Stage Boss BGM. And this is coming from Ninja Gaiden in the arcade, composed by Mikio Saito. Sumo Wrestler, LA Stage and Grand Canyon Stage Boss BGM from Ninja Gaiden in the arcade, composed by Mikio Saito. And so yes, whereas the NES game is a pretty cinematic and well fleshed out story, the arcade version is just a ninja comes from Japan to hellscape of USA and just fights through hordes of Jason masked big boys, sumo wrestlers, weirdos, and ultimately the big bad, Blade Damas. Yes, so whereas the NES version is like this huge adventure through various areas, like probably all over the world, this game takes place throughout, like I said, the hellscape of USA. So starting in LA, going to Los Angeles, going all the way over to New York, where you fight the big bad. And through this, you're fighting various enemies, such as big boys in red shirts with Jason masks, big boys with different kind of masks, palette swap ninjas, sumo wrestlers, and, you know, after you do all this, you eat some sushi, at least after this first stage in Los Angeles. So this game is basically if you took one of those trashy direct-to-video 1980s, 1990s ninja kung fu movies and turned it into a video game. It's just over the top, ridiculous, stupid. The plot is barely held together by cheese string, and yeah. But the gameplay is actually pretty interesting because it actually offers a lot of environmental like, you know, objects to use, because you can swing from light posts to kick enemies. You can jump up from, like, you know, ledges and all this stuff. You know, whereas the NES version, most you could do is, you know, wall jump and stuff. This one actually offers a lot of cool things. And you can do a cool air flip, whereas you grab your enemies by the shoulders and toss them into other enemies, too. So it's pretty cool, varied stuff. So the music by Mikio Saito is, you know, your standard arcade beat-em-up fare from this around this time. But what's cool is that actually Ryuichi Nitta does show up a few times doing the you know, victory BGMs and maybe one of the alternate sound, like Stage 4 BGM, which was released on the overseas versions. So there's another similarity. The composer for the NES version does show up on the arcade version, just in a smaller capacity. And so now this opens up for a possible new topic, is where I'll maybe possibly cover all the different Ninja Gaiden versions, because, you know, there's this arcade version, there's the NES version, there's multiple, like, sequels to the arcade version as well as the NES version, and then there's, like, you know, differences between the soundtracks on these ports as well. So it's a pretty interesting thing I might do. And I hope you enjoyed this little romp through the comparison between these two different versions of the same named game, or games. And yes, there are many other examples of this, but these are probably the more extreme, maybe? I don't know how to say, but yeah, it was a cool little time, you know, because, like, these games were made concurrently with each other. So the NES version was being made at the same time as the arcade version by the same companies, but they had different teams on them, so of course they came out differently. And actually, that kind of brings to the next little inspiration for this episode was St. John's and Hughes of Nerd Noise Radio were talking about this very thing, that you know, there were multiple versions of one game on various consoles, and they'd be vastly different from each other because they were, you know, usually developed by different developers. And how you don't really get that nowadays, because, you know, most games that are on multiple consoles are the same exact game, maybe just like some differences because of controls or, like, you know, processing power of the console, but for the most part, same exact game on all these multiple consoles. So yeah, it's a kind of a really fun thing to do. Just, like, look at games from way back then, you know, like 80s, 90s, even, like, you know, all the way up to, like, the early 2000s, and just their various versions, just like the differences, like, you know, in the soundtrack, the way how they play, the way how they look, all that stuff. It's a pretty interesting little thing to do. And another interesting thing to do, you know, if you're new to the show again, is check out VG Emporium on all your favorite podcatchers, such as Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, Amazon, Audible, and maybe even leave a review if you'd like. And as well as check it out on all your favorite social media, such as Twitter and Instagram, a little bit on Facebook, Mastodon. And hey, if you're feeling extra adventurous, check out the Discord. You can find it in the show notes of this episode, as well as on the main page of the website, vgemporium.wordpress.com. And if you want to send in, like, a special order or a topic suggestion or just say something, send it on over to vgemporium@gmail.com. And if you'd like to take a few more interesting adventures, go check out me out on the social media, such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you know, Rage Cage, as well as on SoundCloud, where I post all my original music as well as some covers, mostly chiptunes. You know, just look up Rage Cage, RAYJKAYJ. So now next week, I have another guest coming in, and it is Martyris of the Re-VGM podcast. And he's bringing with him some chiptune covers and arrangements of modern VGM. So yeah, definitely come on back in next week because it's going to be a fun time. So now we're going to play the episode out here with the last track coming from Ninja Gaiden the arcade. And this is the one other song that was composed by Ryuichi Nitta. This is Everybody Likes Sukiyaki. And this is the Game Clear / ending theme